Hi everyone, my name is Sam Sharp, and this is a recording of my 2024 SICB talk, The Urgent Responsibility of Biologists to Defend Intersex Variation in Human Rights. And I've never tried a QR code in a YouTube video before, but ideally that should get you a link to the PDF of my slides. I'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement for in-person SICB 2024, which is taking place on unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Part of the reason why I include a land acknowledgement is as a reminder that, as Arvin et al. 2013 says, settler colonialism must be understood as a multi-fronted project of making the first peoples of a place extinct is a relentless structure not contained in a period of time. And just as the project of colonial dispossession and extermination of Native Americans on this land continues, so does the contribution to similar settler colonial projects overseas. One example of this is, again, in the land that we are on, which is this unceded land of the Coast Salish people. The municipality of Seattle, built on this unceded land, through taxpayer dollars, contributes over 12 million in federal taxes per year that goes to funding the colonization dispossession of Palestinians, which is an ongoing settler colonial project funded by the United States that's now in a phase of highly escalated settler and military violence. Additionally, given the topic of my presentation today, as we discuss issues of oppression facing sex and gender diverse people, it's important to remember that the construction of the sex and gender binary have occurred through colonialist, eugenic, and supremacist projects. So, to introduce the topic of my talk, I want to reflect on how a year ago, myself and Dr. Kelsey Lewis put together a symposium for SICB on sex diversity and variation. We had some incredible speakers, and I was really excited this year at SICB to find this giant poster of the cover of our ICB issue with Chris Martin's beautiful image of one of his study organisms on it. And last year, after our symposium, myself, Dr. Lewis, and a few of our other speakers were at Torchy's Tacos in Austin, Texas, where we were having conversation about how can we take the ideas from the symposium and translate them to SICB in general and also biologists more broadly. And we got stuck on two questions. The first one was, how do we convince biologists to understand human sex diversity beyond anisogamy? And how do we get them to care? And I'm going to start off with trying to address the first question. So what about anisogamy? And I've had a year to think about this. And one of the things that first comes to mind with me is when we're providing definitions of sex, and I'll focus on human sex for this presentation, but when we're providing definitions of sex, what is the purpose of these definitions? So if we're having a conversation in the setting of kind of academic evolutionary biology, where we're thinking about what is the contribution of an individual to its species in terms of future generations, we can have this platonic ideal of gonoporism, where we can make a lot of assumptions about a population, such as every individual being reproductive or potentially reproductive, and only thinking about what are the ways an individual could contribute genetic material to the next generation. And so this takes us to this idea of anisogamy, which is very gamete focused. So how can an individual contribute genetic material to the next generation? It can pass on genetic material in a small gamete or in a large gamete. So that is the perspective on this of anisogamy. However, once we get beyond kind of theoretical evolutionary conversations, this, in my opinion, stops being a comprehensive or practical definition of sex for most of our purposes. Because generally, when we're talking about sex, we're not only talking about individuals who have reproductive potential at a given time, we're talking about something more comprehensive that needs to be able to be applied in some way to every individual in the population. So another way we might define sex is as a developmental phenotype. So at the individual level, what is an individual sex? And one of the things about humans is that we do not have gametophytes. This is a joke for all the plant people. We are not as cool as ferns. We do not have an independent gamete producing generation. Instead, our gametes are produced within our complicated diploid bodies. And even if we're thinking about, okay, what are the gametes being produced, sperm and ova, they are produced by something. They are produced by specific types of organs. And in addition to those organs, we also need other organs and structures to be attached to them in order for the gametes to get where they need to go to achieve conception. So if you have testes, but you don't have the plumbing that will allow sperm to get out of the body, what does that mean in terms of your sex? And this is not a theoretical example. There's an intersex variation called androgen insensitivity syndrome, in which people are born with internal testes that aren't attached to plumbing that will allow sperm to leave the body. When we think about ovaries, until very recently, it was impossible to contribute genetic material to the next generation if you had ovaries, but you didn't have a fully developed uterus. And again, there are people who have something called MRKH, which is a different intersex variation that means they have ovaries, but they do not have a fully developed uterus. So in terms of people like this, what does that mean for their sex if they do not have these other components of a sex phenotype that are assumed to be present in a strictly anisogamic model, but in reality are not present in everyone's bodies? And there's also people who are born with gonads that have some ovary and some testicular tissue, gonads that have cells that don't fully differentiate, and some people are born without gonads. And there's a variety of other congenital, medical, surgical, or age-related things that can impact gonads and prevent an individual from being able to contribute gametes to the next generation. And beyond this, human sex has all of these other types of variations that can complicate the question of what is an individual's sex when we look at the different ways that these different characteristics can vary individually and in relation to each other in ways that may or may not impact the ability of gametes to be contributed to the next generation, but do impact a definition of sex as a developmental phenotype. And another aspect of sex that may be relevant is, what does sex mean in terms of human experience? What does it mean to be a certain sex? And this brings us to the idea of the social construct of the sex and gender binary. And just so we're all on the same page, as a reminder, a social construct is something that exists because humans agree it exists. That doesn't mean it's fake or even necessarily that it's bad. It just exists because humans agree that it exists. Some examples of social constructs include money, daylight savings time, and countries. And another important thing to keep in mind about social constructs is that they are socially constructed, meaning that the origin is social, not biological, but some social constructs, such as the sex and gender binary, are in fact biologically enforced, even if they are not biologically derived. And so what does sex look like under the sex and gender binary? It looks like there being two categories, the social category of male/man and the social category of female/woman. And these come with expectations such as sex being a contiguous phenotype that comes in the male version or the female version. There's also an expectation that gender identity, which can only be man or woman, will be a quote unquote natural extension of which suite of sex traits you have. There's also this expectation that a person's masculinity or femininity and how they present themselves relative to social signifiers of sex and gender will be an honest signal of which suite of sex traits they have. And within the sex gender binary construct, sometimes people will acknowledge the existence of intersex variation, but it will be treated as rare, something that's pathological, it's bad, and this idea that, well, we can fix that with modern medicine. And not only can we should, because it's a problem that some people's bodies don't match our binary paradigm. And oftentimes people are curious what the origin of the sex gender binary is. And it wasn't a single thing, but a big contributor to this is eugenics. And certain specific events in the 19th century had a really big impact on our current sex and gender binary paradigm. And a lot of this had to do with Darwin's writings being published and eugenicists misappropriating it to claim that sexual dimorphism in humans was a racialized trait. So they argued that the type of humans that were the most evolved and the most superior had the greatest amount of sexual dimorphism. And because these eugenicists tended to be heterosexual Europeans, they claimed that they, as heterosexual Europeans, were the most superior type of people and supported that with this claim that they had the greatest level of sexual dimorphism. And they also argued that other people, including non-Europeans, queer people, intersex people, and sex work, were physically less dimorphic. And at the time that these claims were made, they were not based on science. They were based on social prejudice. And only later were biological justifications kind of brought in to attempt to backfill some kind of evidence for these claims. And the way that the idea of the sex and gender binary that is originated from eugenics continues to be enforced is multifaceted and has social, legal, and medical components. One component is the way that we teach about sex in science and medicine. It's taught as a binary, and I know some people here are working really hard to change that. That is the default paradigm. There is also all of these ways that in order to function in society, you need to navigate this in order to have an identification document that will allow you to do a variety of different things you can't do without one. In many cases, you only have the option of male or female on your ID. There's also facilities that people may need to access, including public bathrooms, locker rooms, and shelters that are segregated by sex, and there is no alternate option if you cannot fit into the male or female option. Another part of this is the use of medical interventions to make intersex people's bodies look less intersex. And a really horrifying way that this happens is by performing non-consensual, non-emergent surgeries on intersex children's bodies in order to reduce the appearance of certain intersex traits. And throughout intersex people's lives, we're often subjected to coercive and aesthetically assumed medical interventions or attempted medical interventions because our bodies are seen as violating this binary sex paradigm. And the same logic leads to the bans or restrictions on consensual medical interventions that some transgender and gender nonconforming people want, that are desired and affirming, but are seen as a threat to the sex binary if they result in people's bodies not matching this sex binary idea as well. And another aspect of this is these social mechanisms of subjecting sex and gender nonconforming people to harassment, violence, and alienation, which disincentivizes being nonconforming. So hopefully I've answered the first question. And the second question is, why should biologists care? And one thing that I've learned about through my science communication training is that the way that you reach people is through what they care about, what they believe in, and what they value. And as biologists, I really hope that we value doing ethical science, not recapitulating eugenics, and not doing harm. I hope we value being accurate and precise in our science and using sex in an accurate, precise, and operationalizable way within our systems. And I hope we value not enforcing bigotry in our teaching or science communication. And when we look at the type of bigotry that exists around sex and gender variation, it's generally based on these misunderstandings of sex as fundamentally binary. And we have the opportunity to help our students and our SciComm audiences understand that this is wrong and help them know better and do better. And what would caring about this look like? It could look like taking an inventory of how you interact with the concept of sex in your work, including your teaching, research, academic and non-academic writing, and science communication. Thinking about if there's things that you're doing that are unconsciously enforcing the sex binary or not fully acknowledging the ways that sex and gender are imposed on transgender and intersex folks in really harmful ways. And thinking about, with the different ideas that we talked about, how can you acknowledge both that sex is biologically a spectrum and that our lives are very impacted by the social construction of the sex and gender binary. And one thing that I would suggest everyone does, if they want to, again, it's not homework, is actually reading about the eugenic history of biological sex. And here are some papers that I suggest as a place to start with this. And I'd like to thank anyone who's listening to this talk, and here are some ways that you can get in touch with me if you want to learn more.